In September 8, 1967 issue of Time magazine, the author of The Science and Snares of Statistics wrote, "Perhaps the time has come for society to be less numerically conscious and therefore less willing to be ruled by statistics." This came from you. What are your thoughts on statistics?
Well, I wrote that?
Yeah. They cited you as saying that.
Really? Mm-hmm. Well, I say a lot of things.
This is
on all sides
30 years
of the
ago.
issue. I am in line with the pervasive developmental cynicism. I'm quite cynical about statistics even today. I think most numbers are like the first page of a novel, and they don't say a lot, and there's a much more to the story than just that first page.
Does this have to do also with your last day on Earth as quantoid?
Yes, it does actually. Mm-hmm.
What's that about?
Well, that was the influence of Bob Stake again, who's always been his views and opinions are so well thought out, carefully thought through that they're very influential. I usually end up not understanding them at first, finally disagreeing with them, and then eventually seeing that he's seen things better than most people have. And the paper I wrote on the last day on Earth as a quantoid was about a time at UCLA in the summer of 1978, and I was there for the summer in Ava Baker Center, and Bob was there for the whole summer. Ernie House had come out for a week or two, and I was presenting to a small group at lunch the work I'd done on meta-analysis of class size research, and afterwards Bob and Ernie and I hung around and talked, and I ended up in the position of defending randomized controlled experiments. Decades later to be favored by the federal government in all research. And Bob was very much developing his notions on qualitative research at that time in his private thoughts. He hadn't written much about it at that point. And we were arguing back and forth, and my position was you can't know causes without randomized controlled experiments. My goodness, I was raised by Julian Stanley, the Campbell-Stanley chapter. What else could I think or believe? And Bob eventually said that on the question of causes, and say in an area like education or instruction or teaching, that he would believe an intelligent, observant teacher or principal about what those causal relationships are in the classroom before he'd believe some outsider coming in with his randomization and his measurements and his significance tests. And then something about the moment, or maybe what had transpired before it, or the arguments that led up to it, that really struck me, and I thought he's probably right, and I still think he's probably right.
And so what are your opinions on the N=1 studies?
The N=1 study?
Just small case study types of research, in terms of given your background with large scale and meta-analysis.
Right. Yeah, I thought that I really had the naive belief at the start of the meta-analysis work and some of those books I wrote that just the force of all of these studies put together and understood, and this number with tens of thousands of cases lying behind it would just roll over opposition, that everyone would, even the opponents would lay down their arms and say, yes, that's it. the effect really is this, or the correlation truly is this. Well, that never happened a bit, and still doesn't happen. In some areas of medicine, it's kind of making some waves that way, though it's not entirely that simple. But medicine is so simple. There's a drug, there's a surgical technique, there's a pretty much agreed upon outcome, or 2 or 3 outcomes, how much blood's lost and how many days to recovery, or they're out of the hospital. Education is orders of magnitude more complex than that. And no meta-analysis I know of ever changed the mind of someone who believed the opposite before they encountered the results of the meta-analysis. Some of them give comfort and support to people who believed that result anyway, and so the debate rages on. But it was criticisms from Lee Cronbach that really got me, really impressed me. At one stage, maybe meta-analysis had been around for 10 years or so, and I had often been put in the position of arguing against people who say, well, you can't say this treatment has this effect because it all depends on this type of student and that type of teacher and this month of the year, and that seemed to be so much nif-gnawing and evasion that I was often put in a position of saying, no, it is true, this is the effect, and that's it, you better believe it. And Lee wrote a piece in which he called that said I was a believer in the flat earth, that there aren't important interactions and and everything is quite simple and effects have quite simple effects and you don't worry about all their various interactions with other circumstances. And he later, in his book on designing evaluations of educational and social programs, wrote a criticism of the internally valid randomized experiment. He said it produces a fact of no general significance whatsoever. And he said all problems are problems of generalization in a field as complex as ours. And well, what is it that our field is producing then? You know, if our best established facts die out in a year, or are fine in Akron, but they don't even hold up in Toledo. And Lee says in his book that the contribution of what these research has made to people is that it has given them points of view, perspectives, and concepts that they use to deal with their own particular circumstances. It doesn't give them certified 100,000 subject meta-analyzed facts that they go out and put to use. That it gives them a way of looking at their own life and their own surrounding and how to manage it. And I think that is the message. You know, I'm generally 30 years behind Cronbach and trying to catch up and see the world as he saw it. I think he was an extremely bright man, and perhaps my work's done now since he's now gone and can't produce any more new ideas.
Tell us about the journal you founded, Education Policy Analysis Archives, and your thoughts about scholarly digital publishing and open access research journals. This is something David Berliner and Gustavo Fishman also note as one of your most noteworthy contributions, as scholarship worldwide has been enriched by your groundbreaking, backbreaking, innovative, and pioneering work in this area.
Well, I'm very dedicated to open access to scholarship, and that means free to read, no cost to read. Why we as academics all these years have given our work over to profit-making companies who then who make significant profits out of selling it to other people has never made any sense to me. It made some sense 50 years ago when stuff was put into hard type and books were bound and shipped through the mail. but with communication technologies being what they are, and now having been that for 20-some years, there's no excuse for paper publication anymore, though I've been unsuccessful in killing paper publication in scholarly areas. It started with me in the early 90s. My pattern was to be resident in Arizona for 9 months and then go for 3 months during the hottest part of the year to Colorado, where it was much cooler. But I felt like I was abandoning my students when I went away for 3 months, and felt guilty about it. And until one of my students showed me email. This was 1989, actually, and it was pretty novel then. And I realized this is great. I can be present with them and respond in very short order, and it's not going to cost them, it's not going to cost me. And so I became very excited about email and taught it to all my students, and carried on conversation and interaction with them over the summer, and then it spread to the entire year, and pretty soon it was obvious that my colleagues and I could start discussing things through listservs and whatnot, which I did for 2 or 3 years. And then the question arose, well, what about more sustained, serious work, perhaps, that ought to be archived? And that's like a journal, and I created probably the second electronic journal in education. There was one before that, in a year or two older, in distance education, but I created one in policy analysis in about '93, and still going strong. And these days I spend most of my time editing, managing a book review journal that's online and open access, and entertains 1,500 to 2,000 people a day who come in and download book reviews. And and I've predicted at every stage along that way that in 5 years all paper journals would be gone and everything would be open access and online. And of course I've been wrong at every point, and I'm still wrong about it, but it hasn't staunched my enthusiasm for it. And there are now maybe 300 open access online journals in education, and I think it's a wonderful contribution to make to the world, much more to the world than just the U.S., because access to information outside the U.S. has been problematic for a long time, still is in many places.
Sure. In 2000, you were honored and elected into the National Academy of Education for your distinguished contributions to research and education. In 2004, you became a Regents Professor at Arizona State, largely for your work in statistics, but also your educational policy research. In terms of your scholarship here, what are your thoughts about charter schools?
I'm again, contrarian again. A lot of people like them. I think they're unnecessary, and I think they arise out of the worst. They arise out of poor motives on several sides. It's not a mistake that they've arisen at this point in time in history. I think it has to do with money, the cost of education, and it has to do with the wish to isolate oneself and one's children from other people. And as we all know, there are many, many more other people in the United States today that largely the white middle class doesn't want their children to associate with. So I think the charter schools have contributed a lot to resegregating public education along social class and ethnic and racial lines, which is a very bad thing to do. And they're held up as a model of a cheap, inexpensive form of education, stripped down to the basic skills, which to my mind are basic to nothing except obsolescence, inevitable obsolescence. And that's charter schools for me. Have no interest other than seeing them become a experiment receding into history. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about your thoughts on high-stakes tests?
Damaging to education, terrible. Again, built only around these basic skills that nobody uses once they become an adult. Nobody uses arithmetic to any real extent, and you don't have to know how to spell anymore. Reading is becoming increasingly obsolete with YouTube and telephone voicemail and whatnot. And the public schools are so conservative in curriculum, so reluctant to change and move with the times into the future. And I think it's because they are a common school that at least 75% of the population now, or maybe perhaps 80, it's declining, still is thrown together in. And you have the problem of you must reach some consensus over what is taught in them. And with the great dissensus in the country and the widely differing political views and moral views, the only thing people could agree on is something that's totally irrelevant. And that then becomes the curriculum of the public schools. And if you look at it, it is pretty much useless and something you'll never use the rest of your life. When in fact it ought to be about the things that are truly important to young people becoming adults, like their health, for example. Mm-hmm. Obesity. Obesity is probably costing this country more than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the schools play no significant part in that at all, except now they're contracting with Pepsi and Frito-Lay and other companies to put fast foods in the school to make the kids even worse off in terms of their health. And financial management and what consumer credit is like. This ought to be a central part of the education of adolescents in the schools. But my goodness, the banks would be at the state school board in a minute if you tried to do anything significant in terms of curriculum and something like that. I could go on, but there's two big enemies.
You did in Fertilizers, Pills, and Magnetic Strips. You talked a lot about this in your most recent book.
Yeah.
So what inspired the writing of this book?
Well, as I say in the foreword, it's a ripoff of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. What was so impressive about Diamond was how he took cultural phenomena available to everyone and took it down to such absolutely basic fundamental levels as things like the availability of food and whatnot. I look at education and education reform, and I think it's all a show. It's all smoke and mirrors. And everything that's talked about, and the charter schools and tuition tax credits and crossing school boundaries and high-stakes testing and stuff, I don't think it has anything to do with the quality of education or economic competitiveness in the world or the life of children after school. I think it's all about money, the money of the middle class, their property taxes, and it's about racial suspicion and antipathy, the different races not wanting to be, being afraid of each other, wanting to separate. And so, yeah, I was striving for something that we can relate to. We all, faculty, talk about nothing so much with each other as they talk about money. Mm. Their salary and their taxes and the value of their house and so forth. It's basic to everyone. And also, racial antipathies are evident everywhere in the United States, in every aspect of life. And any bus you get into, any neighborhood you drive to. These are what are really driving policies in this country today, it seems to me, and certainly in education. You take any of the hot issues in education and you'll find behind it an economic interest, usually of the white middle class. Advanced placement, it's a way of getting cheap, it's a way of not having to pay for college credits if you can get 12 or 16 or 24 of them out of the way before you even get to school. And high stakes testing will show that all that's important is passing a few tests. Arizona introduced a bill, probably adopted the bill, that if you can pass the high stakes test in the fall, they'll give you a $1,500 scholarship to go to a community college in the spring. Isn't that generous? No, it's not. It's a way of kicking you out of school and cutting the $9,000 expenditure, $7,000 expenditure in half, and compensating it by $1,500 instead of paying $3,500 for the kid to stay in school. Everything I've seen, all the debates going on in education, everything I've seen for the last several years, you can analyze in terms of somebody's purse and somebody's feeling about the other culture they don't understand or don't want to associate with.
On that note, in the book you state that Arizona is the state to watch in terms of educational policy and its state educational system. Why?
Everything that's bad that's going to happen in education policy will probably start in this state. We have an amazing record of bad ideas that aren't just talked about but actually get implemented. We're a leader in everything pernicious to teachers and to students. The reason we're a leader is that we embody the 2 or 3 major forces that are determining education policy in the country. That's demographics and economics. Our demographics are huge growth in the Hispanic population, and that is the ethnic group that is burgeoning in this country. The African American population is pretty much at replacement level and growing very slowly. The white population as a percentage is declining, but the Hispanic population is increasing enormously. And that is having a lot of effect on education policies that are getting tough on students and also providing escapes for white middle class students. Then policy is made by older white middle class people. They control politics. And Arizona, its demographics are young Hispanics and older white middle class who are retired or on fixed incomes, have come here from other states. In many cases, they have a very strong motive to reduce the costs of education, to reduce their taxes and reduce their property taxes. So we are the test tube for education policy for the whole country, because we're ahead of where the country is going. Arizona is now where the country will be in 20 and in 30 years.